The Persona series has its roots in Jungian psychology, and because of this, many of its dungeons and enemies have symbolism based on the mental issues of those they were birthed from. In this game's case, the first 4 labyrinths all sprung from Rei's memories, but before I get into talking about them, I'll preface this with a spoiler warning. Everything I'm about to discuss hinges on the big reveal about Rei's true nature that happens at the end of the 4th labyrinth. If you haven't played that far, do not watch this video. This is your last warning to turn back. But if you're still here, let's dive right into it. In the cutscene after the 4th labyrinth, Zen describes how the labyrinths and the guardians came to be.
This world will disappear? Is that because Rei-chan created it? Didn't you say before that Rei-chan created the school?
No, I created it. I had only remembered some of the details at that time. In actuality, I used my powers to base this place on Rei's memories. Yes. I left my powers as Chronos to a split half of myself, and hid it in this clock tower. I sealed my memories as well, and hid them in a number of rooms in this school, along with Rei's things. Those rooms eventually became labyrinths, to prevent the truths within from being discovered.
Essentially, both of them are Rei's mental defense system given physical form, shielding her from remembering the truth of her painful past life. Zen also mentions they were based on Rei's memories. The first of which is memories of a picture book that Rei is implied to have read as a child, based off of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. Obviously, this is represented by the labyrinth U in Wonderland. On the surface, there's not that much to say about this one. It's basically just a giant reference to the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and it mostly exists here because Rei happened to like that book. Digging a little deeper though, I found a few things that might tie into Rei's overall state of mind and her past. In both the original Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the sequel Through the Looking Glass, as well as most famous adaptations, all of Wonderland turns out to be a dream occurring in Alice's mind. And the characters within are all implied to be based off of people or other aspects of her real life, and in the end she wakes up to the real world. This sounds very similar to the role the labyrinths serve for Rei, magical fantasy worlds that she becomes lost in, born from her own memories, but eventually she has to wake up and face the harshness of reality. Now all of this is a bit more tangential, but there are a lot of themes explored in both these books that fit very well with the Persona series. Through the Looking Glass ends with Alice wondering if everything that happened during the story was all part of the Red King's dream, and that maybe she's just a figment of his imagination. Apparently the book's final line is, "Life, what is it but a dream?" A statement that definitely fits a major theme of both Persona 3 and Rei's character, that of the fleeting nature of life. As another side note, there are a lot of quotes from Alice in Wonderland that would definitely fit the themes of a Persona game. Going back into the actual gameplay though, a major gimmick of the dungeon is chasing a rabbit across the various floors. But every time it seems like you've cornered it, it always escapes through a painting, or, in the case of the last time you corner it, disappears entirely. While this is a reference to the White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, it could also reference 2 other things. The first is Rei's pursuit of the truth in exploring these dungeons, and how that truth always seems out of reach. The second could be Rei's search for meaning in her life. And the rabbit disappearing entirely when finally cornered at the end of the dungeon could represent Rei's feelings that her search for meaning was ultimately fruitless in the end. Then we come to the first Guardian, the Queen of Hearts. We know that all the Guardians are shadows born from Rei, each representing an aspect of her memories and her mental state. The Queen of Hearts is probably the least interesting one, because she's very much just a variant of the iconic Alice in Wonderland character of the same name. Lewis Carroll himself described the Queen of Hearts as a sort of embodiment of ungovernable passion, a blind and aimless fury. This definitely shows in her mannerisms and general attitude during the fight. Though this version strangely lacks the character's iconic trait of ordering executions. The Queen of Hearts is supposed to have an android-like appearance according to the art book, and her dress looks like the quilt of a bed. She also has elongating arms that can be seen during her physical attack animations that are covered in thorns. In other words, her arms resemble rose stems, which references the roses she orders painted both in the dungeon and the original story. Before the fight, she says this:
"I won't let you have this. Not even if our king demands it."
After the events of the 4th dungeon, it's obvious the king she's referring to here is Zen, aka Kronos. Other than that, there's not a lot here, but there is one very common fan theory regarding this boss, and that is that the Queen of Hearts is based on Rei's memories of her mother. There isn't a lot in-game to really suggest this, as Rei's mother is only referred to in a few lines, though from those few lines we can gather she was definitely not the nicest of people.
My mom disappeared after that. She said she didn't want me. Maybe she shouldn't have given birth to me. My name's Nico. The nurse guessed it's because my mom wanted me to smile and be happy, but that's not it. I was named Nico because I was the second child. My mom said so.
It's definitely possible that Rei saw a lot of her mother in the Queen of Hearts when she was reading Alice in Wonderland. But as I said, this is mostly just speculation, as the game doesn't focus on Rei's mother very much when describing her backstory. Still, it's a theory that I think definitely has merit. While the group date cafe is pretty much one giant shipping simulator and the most light-hearted of all 4 of these dungeons, it takes on a tragic new light when you know what it actually represents, and this is best summed up by how Rei describes the treasure found within it, the toy ring.
And this is a ring. When I was little, my mom bought it for me at a festival. She said I would have a beautiful wedding. I asked if Prince Charming would come, and she said he would.
The group date cafe, put simply, represents Rei's desire to find love someday. Her dreams of finding her own Prince Charming or destined partner. The bright pink and white colours and upbeat atmosphere of the earlier floors could symbolise the young Rei's simple, idealised, and some could say naive view of romance. The second half of the dungeon takes on a much darker appearance, and the former cute images like teddy bears are transformed into nightmarish monstrosities. Also, chain motifs are frequently seen throughout the dungeon, but they become a lot more common in the second half. The dungeon's shift to a darker tone could represent the hard-hitting realization of Rei's tragic situation. As much as she wants to find love someday, that will never happen because she's fated to die young. The chains, I feel, tie into a major theme of this labyrinth that shows itself both in the design and the gameplay. This theme is restriction and the illusion of choice. All throughout the dungeon, you are constantly told by the mechanical voice that you're choosing your destined partner and vowing your eternal love to one another of your own free will. The phrase free will is often repeated. But when you actually think about it, there isn't a choice at all. It's impossible to proceed to the next floor of the labyrinth unless you go through every selection room of destiny. And in the very last floor, when your destined partner is finally chosen, your hands are forcibly bound together, you're led down a straight linear path with no possible deviations, and you're basically forced to get married whether you want to or not. What does this all mean? Well, I want to talk about the boss first because he also heavily plays into this theme of restriction. Just like the labyrinth itself, the merciful clergyman appears comical at first glance, but actually has a lot of tragic symbolism involving Rei's fate. He's presented as a priest presiding over a wedding, but really acts more like he's presiding over a funeral.
Prepare to meet your maker, for now you shall die!
The priest's face looks almost corpse-like, with a mouth that seems stitched shut. His multiple limbs give him a very spider-like appearance, which foreshadows the appearance of the true master of the Labryinths. And he's chained to a coffin. During the battle, the merciful clergyman specialized in inflicting paralysis and binds, all status ailments that restrict your actions, as well as further restricting your actions through the vow mechanic, forbidding you from taking a certain action, otherwise you get hit with heavy damage and even more binds. So, where am I going with this whole restriction thing? I feel like it represents how Rei was tied down from achieving what she really wanted in life by her illness. Rei wanted to go to school, make friends, and find love someday, but she wasn't able to do any of that because she was stuck in a hospital and terminally ill. From a young age, she was probably told she could do whatever she wanted in life, but the truth is, she really couldn't. The moment that illness showed itself, her fate was already sealed. As grim as it sounds, the priest being chained to that coffin is a perfect representation of Rei's condition. Rei also says this during the big reveal scene.
I prayed to God every day, and not one prayer was granted.
And it's possible the merciful clergyman was born from those thoughts as well. It's also possible that the merciful clergyman may be based on an actual priest who visited Rei while she was on her deathbed, but I personally prefer the more metaphorical interpretation. Now we come to the Evil Spirit Club. Rei was always terrified of the truth hidden in these labyrinths, and this one brings her fears right to the forefront. The Evil Spirit Club, in my opinion, represents Rei's fear of death, and the very moment of her death itself. The first half is based on a school. This obviously comes from the fact that Rei was supposed to go to Yasogami High, and that she'd always hear the chiming of its bell from her hospital bed. She wished she could go there, but in the end she never got the chance. There's a cruel sense of irony in the design of the first 2 floors of this labyrinth. It takes Rei's desire to go to school and turns it into something of fear and horror, mirroring the cruel separation between the life Rei wanted to have and the one she was destined to have. If you can read Japanese though, the text on the blackboards in the first half of the dungeon spells out some pretty important information. The dates are all listed as the 4th of the 4th. 4 in Japanese culture is a number that signifies death because one of its pronunciations is the same as the Japanese word for death. But what's written on all of these blackboards below that date? I don't want to die. A statement you probably brush off as part of the stock horror movie atmosphere at first, before you realise that it's actually Rei's inner thoughts. The second half makes this labyrinth's meaning much more obvious. It straight up becomes a hospital. It's here that hints to the labyrinth's true nature really start coming through, as at one point, Rei mentions remembering the doctors carrying keycards, despite the fact that you've never seen any doctors in the labyrinth up until that point. Clearly, Nico's memories of the real world are starting to bleed into her life as Rei in the labyrinths. The FOEs in this labyrinth may have some symbolism to them too. The first one, the cute baby, some people say looks like an aborted fetus, which might represent Rei's wish to have never been born. I feel like that's kind of reaching though. The lovely doll FOEs stay hidden beneath the surface, with only a small portion of themselves visible until you actually run into one. This is a common trope with horror movie monsters invoking a fear of the unknown, but it's also common to use monsters like this to symbolize an uncomfortable truth hidden beneath the surface. The giggling doll popping out of nowhere is scary enough, but that's nothing compared to what these FOEs actually look like. This sums up Rei's situation in this game quite well. She's scared to go into the labyrinths because of all the monsters, but the truth about her that's hidden within these labyrinths is much, much scarier. Then we come to the actual boss of the labyrinth, the kind doctor and the calm and caring nurses. Much like the labyrinth, this boss also seems like a generic horror trope at first, But once the reveal hits, it instantly becomes painfully obvious what this fight represents. This is Rei's last moments on the operating table, and the kind doctor's dialogue is probably exactly what she heard in those moments.
Now, this might hurt just a bit, but it'll be all right. Oh, someone seems to be in high spirits today. Maybe you're ready for the operation. I'm known all over as a skilled surgeon. It'll be over before you know it. No! What's wrong? The condition's getting worse. Emergency surgery is called for. Don't worry. We'll save you.
The doctor and nurses have very disproportioned bodies and make jerky spasm-like movements. This could represent how Rei saw them while she was very heavily anesthetized. The Doctor himself, though, also heavily resembles a cancerous growth or tumor. It's not specifically stated whether Rei had cancer, but given that she lost her hair, it could likely be the disease that took her life, and in this case, the kind Doctor's design is quite obvious in what it represents. The way these bosses fight even mimics how an operation would play out. One of the nurses provides support to the Doctor, the other debilitates you, the patient, to prevent you from struggling, while the Doctor himself inflicts brutal physical attacks. One final thing I want to talk about with this fight is the names of these enemies. Kind Doctor, Calm Nurse, and Caring Nurse all seem ironic or sarcastic when you first do the fight, but at least when it comes to the nurses, those names might have been literal. Rei mentions how one of the nurses personally stitched a jacket for her stuffed rabbit. As for the Doctor himself, I feel it's somewhat debatable. If you bring Rei into this fight, she says when it begins,
No! I don't want you! Get away!
It's all right, Rei. Calm down.
This is just a personal theory with not much in-game to back it up besides that one line, but what if the Doctor who operated on Rei was known to be incompetent? That would put her death in an even more tragic light. So, with the Evil Spirit Club representing Rei's death, and the boss fight representing her last moments on the operating table, why is there one more labyrinth? To me, the Inn of the Pride exhibit is Rei's funeral, plain and simple. While it appears to be styled after traditional Japanese harvest festivals, and might be based on festivals Rei attended as a child if her dialogue about the toy ring is any indication, one of the most common festivals among all cultures is one mourning the death of a loved one and celebrating their life, and I feel that's the kind of festival the Inn of the Pride exhibit really is. Its vibrant, upbeat atmosphere reminds me of a wake, a funeral service focused on remembering the good times in a person's life. Another thing that leads me to believe this represents a funeral is the Holy Flame. You spend the entire dungeon carrying a torch, and using it to light various bonfires in order to progress. This could be a reference to funeral pyres and cremation. According to surveys, 99.9% of Japanese are cremated these days. In Japan, wakes are usually more somber affairs and are conducted as Buddhist ceremonies, but what's interesting is that their term for a wake is Suya, literally passing the night. Every floor of the Inn of a Pride exhibit is referred to as a night. I'm sure everyone's wondering though, where the heck do the FOEs come from, and why do they look like palette swaps of the ones from Shadow Kanji's dungeon back in Persona 4? I personally think this all stems from the conversation that the party members have upon entering the Inn of a Pride exhibit, where they put images in Rei's head of Kanji wearing a loincloth. At that point, everyone has found out the labyrinth is tied to Rei's mind, which could mean that unbeknownst to them, they now have more influence on it. And by putting those thoughts in Rei's head, the FOEs in the dungeon change to fit that image. I mentioned during the playthrough that the 4 celestial animals could have some symbolism regarding this whole process. I wasn't able to turn up much regarding them themselves, but I did mention that on the final floor, the last golden pilgrimage gate is located in the exact center. representing Koryu, the golden dragon, master of the 4 celestial animals. Now, in Chinese mythology, the golden dragon symbolizes the element of earth, but the Japanese equivalent of the 5th element is void or nothingness. And what's located in the center behind that golden door? The very end of the dungeon where Rei finds out the truth, that she felt her life was completely devoid of meaning. I know I'm kind of reaching with that theory, but I feel it does fit in a few ways. And speaking of what lies at the end, time to address the elephant in the room. I specifically didn't talk about this during my trek through the dungeon because I wanted to mention it now. The boss fight at the end of the Inner Pride exhibit is foreshadowed if you listen closely to the music that plays from the 2nd floor onward. Some people caught this while watching the videos, but yes, that is indeed the main refrain from I'll Face Myself. The boss theme for fighting the shadows of the party members back in Persona 4.
Counting on you.
Before I talk about the boss, I want to talk about the final night itself. It is a very stark contrast to the rest of the dungeon, and I feel that also symbolizes something specific. The bright and vibrant reds and yellows of the earlier floors are replaced with the dark grey colour of burnt out ashes. The energetic music of the earlier floors is gone and replaced with a very slow, somber piano piece. And at the end of the path is the coffin. I feel like this floor represents the feeling that comes at the end of a funeral. After all the reminiscing, telling stories about the person's past life, the joyous celebration, comes the realization that that loved one is now gone forever. The fire on the funeral pyre has burned out and only the ashes remain. And if that's not depressing enough for you, let's talk about Rei's actual shadow! If you played Persona 4, you should be pretty familiar with what a shadow is. The concept is rooted in the psychology of Carl Jung, representing an unconscious aspect of the personality which the conscious ego does not identify in itself. Hidden thoughts that we deny about ourselves, usually negative ones. According to Jung, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. In Rei's case, her shadow represents that one underlying fear she has in her death, that her life ultimately meant nothing and that it would have been better if she was never born. Considering how deeply in denial Rei is when we meet her though, the shadow also represents the very fact she is dead. Just like the shadows of the party members in Persona 4, upon being encountered and denied by Rei, it transforms into a monstrous berserk form. Now, interestingly, the shadows in P4 only attain this form by absorbing all of the shadows in the area. Rei's shadow doesn't need to do that, and I feel like this is because the labyrinths are very different to Persona 4's TV world. Persona 4's TV world is tied to all humans, not just the victims thrown into the TV, so the basic shadows there come from all humanity. These labyrinths though, they all come from Rei specifically. Everything in them was born from her, and as a result, Rei's shadow already has everything it needs to transform. That's just my personal theory. In its berserk form, Rei's shadow, or the best friend, takes the form of a giant monstrous version of the stuffed rabbit that she often carried around with her. It's also extremely bestial and violent, on a level not seen by any of the earlier bosses or even any of the party members' shadows in Persona 4. Those ones were quite chatty.
I am a shadow, the true self. Now, my prince, why don't we dance and make merry together?
But the moment Rei's shadow transforms, it stops talking, and it's the only boss in the game to not speak during battle. Here's why I think this is the case. The Persona 4 party members have only been denying their shadow since relatively recently. Rei has been denying her shadow for 12 years. It's been berserk for a very long time. I always felt this aspect of shadows was symbolic of mental health issues in the real world. The longer you go without addressing them, the worse they become. The Persona 4 characters were lucky enough to get help quickly. Rei's condition has been going on for a lot longer, and as a result is much harder to solve. On that note, the first time Rei's shadow is reduced to 0 HP during battle, it revives itself with half its max HP. This thing is persistent, and for good reason. Rei very stubbornly refuses to accept the truth, trapping herself in this fantasy world where she can pretend that she's still alive, and pretend that all of that tragedy in her past life never happened. Her shadow's persistence represents both that, and paradoxically kind of the opposite. That the acceptance of the truth is inevitable, and it's not something that will go away. It will keep rising up until Rei finally does accept it. Now let's talk about the shadow's actual appearance. While it's based off Rei's stuffed doll, that doll in turn was based on the White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, and I feel this has a lot of symbolism involving Rei. The White Rabbit is always characterized as having an obsession with time, which makes her connection to Kronos all the more fitting. Some people wonder why they used Kronos, one who holds dominion over time and a Greek titan, to represent death. But time and death have always been linked in classical literature. No one lives forever and time is constantly moving forward. Therefore, time kills everyone eventually.
No one can escape time. It delivers us all to the same end.
There's a reason why clocks are a common visual motif in Persona 3, and going into a different series for a second, there's a reason why death is often fought in the clock tower in Castlevania games. Time and death always go hand in hand, so in a way the White Rabbit really fits here. Secondly, although this is a little bit of a stretch, the White Rabbit is constantly late for something. Rei, in turn, is late for her appointment with death. And, you know, the word late is often used to describe someone who's passed away. After the battle, Rei continues to deny her shadow, much like a certain character from Persona 4 whose name I won't mention in case you haven't played that game. And just like in that case, her shadow disappears. We know that from Persona 4 that by accepting your shadow as part of yourself, it transformed into a persona, which makes me wonder, if Rei was able to accept her shadow, what would her persona be? My personal theory is that her persona would be Alice. Now, Alice is a recurring summon in the Shin Megami Tensei series, but it's not unheard of for a formerly generic persona or demon to become a character's personal one in a later game. Take Mikazuchi went from a generic persona in P3 to Kanji's personal one in P4, and the same thing happened with Seiten Taisei for Ryuji in Persona 5. So it's not much of a stretch to think that someone could have Alice as their personal persona, but I think Alice fits for Rei in more ways than one. Firstly, it ties into her love of Alice in Wonderland as a child, but it also fits the depiction of Alice in the Shin Megami Tensei games, her being the ghost of a blonde-haired girl who died at a young age. In those games, Alice traditionally has two supernatural guardians, Belial and Nebiros, just like Rei has her own supernatural guardian in Zen. In Persona 3, 4, and 5, Alice is weak to light but has some form of resistance to dark, the exact same affinities that Rei possesses. I feel this makes sense, however, it was not to be, as she continued to deny her shadow. Because of this, in the conversation that occurs later, Rei is temporarily possessed by her shadow for one line. This has very dark implications, because one of the few other people who's done this in the Persona series is the killer in Persona 4. I've always felt that this represents an aspect of Jungian psychology, that of someone refusing to accept their shadow and instead merging with it. A man who is possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps, living below his own level, according to Jung himself. This just goes to show how deep Rei's denial really is, and just how unhealthy her mental state has become. Talking about this any further would get into theories about Persona 4's killer that I'd rather discuss if I covered that game, so I'll stop for now. I'll conclude this video by bringing up a few lines that either were foreshadowing towards this reveal, or take on a particularly ironic new light after this reveal. And that's all I wanted to discuss here. I'll be talking about the symbolism behind the final dungeons, FOEs, and bosses when we get there, as unlike the earlier dungeons, there's no reason to hold off talking about those, so they won't be included within this video. I hope you've enjoyed this rambling about my thoughts on the symbolism of this game's dungeons and bosses, and feel free to share your own theories in the comments. Next time, we head into the clock tower to save Rei. See you all then.